Okay, so let's start by today by taking a looking at choosing research design. So this idea of balancing the ideals and the realities of conducting research within counseling. And so what we're going to talk a little bit about today is this, how are we going to choose a design that's going to best fit with what we want to do and what we can do? Because we have to remember that it's not always just what we want to do, because there's tons of paradigms or phenomena that we would love to study, but we may not be able to for many different reasons. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in this presentation. So traditionally, scholars have identified three components, sometimes known as the research trinity, that forms the backbone of all research. So that is design, it is measurement, and then analysis. So we're going to talk a little bit about the design piece today. The measurement has to do more with the how are you going to measure the construct, not the statistics of it, and then the analysis actually is the statistics are part of that analysis, and then looking at those statistics and trying to decipher or make something out of that. Something that we're doing in class right now, which I think is going to be really neat, is we're going to take a look at the data and we're going to come to a decision on kind of what we think is going on with that. And so there is some subjectivity that comes into the objectivity of the statistics of the analysis of the measurement. That's all based on the design, if that all makes sense. So design provides the conceptual framework for which a study is structured and the way that it is executed as well. And so again, because you guys are advanced counseling researchers, I want you to think how analogous that is to counseling in of itself, right? When we work with a client, we have to have some kind of perceptual framework or conceptual framework that that we use when we're with our clients, and that framework is structured, and we execute based on what our theory tells us, or how we understand human beings, and we're going to execute in that way. So there's five critical components of the research design. That's the sample, the conditions, the method of assignment to groups or conditions, the data collection, and the timing of study procedures. All of these are very, very, very important. We have to be very precise when we're looking at our sample, and be able to define who is part. So you have to have what we call inclusionary data, and then you also have the exclusionary data, or the constructs that you're going to say who can be in the study and who cannot be in the study. The conditions that they're being studied under, typically for us, the conditions will happen if we're working with people in a live setting. We'll have to really talk about those conditions, kind of like what we're doing in class now, where we're just gathering data from the internet. There's really no condition that will be set for that. Method of assessment to groups or these conditions. And that's kind of, again, that understanding of theory, or the understanding of how we're going to assess, and what assessments we're going to use on one group or condition, or another group and another condition. Data collection, obviously, how are we going to collect the data, and then the timing of the study procedures as well. So taking a look and saying, are we going to be measuring pre-post? Are we going to be measuring just post? Are we going to be measuring over a continuum, doing something longitudinal in nature? So we have to be aware of how we want to conduct the timing of the study, and realistically, what timing do we have? So measurement includes identifying the variables of interest, operationally defining the variables so that'll allow them to be measured within the sample, and collecting data that are used for analysis. And so in previous videos, we talked about defining the variables so that others will be able to replicate the study, but also you want to operationally define the variables so that you don't start becoming confused with what you're looking at. And I think we kind of experienced that in class, where we said counseling, counselor, therapist, therapy, psychology, psychologist, and then all of a sudden we started getting into kind of this minutia of, well, what about cognitive behavioral therapy? What about the way that this therapy is used? And so by operationally defining what we were looking at, we should be able to stick with that. And then, of course, there's going to be a little bit of gray area, like I said, because we're collecting so much data in our study. We do have the tendency for any outliers to be offset by potential other outliers, and regression to the mean happens relatively easily with a large data set. So we're not going to have to be too concerned. We're also going to do some analysis on our data to make sure that we're not violating any norms of homogeneity, and that there's different statistics that we'll look at to tell us if our data are normal, and if they're not, how we can sort of trim outliers out of our data so that we can have a normal data set. And then the analysis involves the use of statistical tools in testing hypothesis or coding strategies to examine research questions, which is used in qualitative designs. And we just had this conversation the other day at lunch, the faculty here, about how the government has changed the definition of research, or to define what research is and how it is to be conducted. And basically what the government has stated is that qualitative research is not really going to be viewed as research or for funding purposes from the government, and that research deals with quantitative data or numerical data. So this is going to be an interesting paradigm shift as we go through the next few years as researchers, because we may not need to go through IRB for qualitative designs, although I still go through the IRB for any time I'm working with any human participants to make sure that I'm safe and that they're safe, obviously, as well. So some design research myths. So the basic task of the scientist is, and don't forget you guys are scientists now, is to design research in such a way as to describe a phenomena or identify relationships between constructs while ruling out as many plausible rival hypotheses or explanation as possible. So the goal, simply put, is to more fully understand a phenomena or construct, even though many sources of bias and confounding variables might distort that understanding. Some of those confounding variables, and if we don't know that it's there, it might be a latent variable, or these sources of bias we may not be able to control for. And therefore, we have to be able to at least note when we write manuscripts and we're presenting our data to individuals, whether it's in a presentation format or it's in a manuscript format, we need to be able to discuss those limitations with our audience and talk about the confounding variables that were there that we could not control for, and let them know that our data may be skewed because of that. And that's okay. So when you're designing, we want to be able to take out as many sources of these biases and variables, but in reality, you're not going to be able to take them all out, or maybe even many of them. And that's okay. And this is where kind of that muddying of research, where it may not feel good because it's not black and white or right or wrong. And the more research you do, the more you'll come to understand that research is fairly subjective. And the way I guess that I kind of what helps me get through that piece is that even though I may control for every single variable and phenomena that may happen, and I present the data, people still may question or may not like it, or it could be the most subjective study, and I put it out there and people are questioning it, and that's okay. They're allowed to, and that's actually a very healthy thing. We want people to challenge our research and say, yeah, it's flawed, because all research is flawed. I haven't seen any research that's not flawed. I mean, look at our opioid epidemic we have right now, right? Research told us that opioids were not addictive or highly addictive, and we know that to be completely false. So that's okay, and we're allowed to do that. And I think that the more comfortable you become as a researcher, the more comfortable you become challenging other people's research. I'm one of those, I'm like the worst person to go to a conference with, because I'll sit there and just pick apart the methodology that people use and forget that that we can't control for everything. But if you're truthful and honest and forthcoming about your limitations, then that takes away that whole piece. And you kind of take the wind out of people's sails for wanting to shoot your research out or be critical about your research if you put it out there first. And for me, I know I'm way more accepting of that research when I hear the researchers say, listen, here are some variables that we know were in there that we couldn't control for. And that gives me a better or a more belief that the level of veracity that they are portraying their data, and I'm more likely to believe what they have to say. So research design is the tool that researchers use to frame a study. It involves developing a plan or a procedure to conduct the investigation. So one of the more critical decisions in research is selecting a design that the strengths and the weaknesses help the researcher to examine specific research questions and rule out as many plausible rival hypotheses or explanations as possible, kind of as we've been saying. So unfortunately, it's not uncommon for researchers to assume that a given design is better than others. And this happens often, especially when I'm working with students. For example, excuse me, it's morning and I need my coffee. Um, Research in the past have examined questions like, does counseling therapy work? Right? What is the best type of counseling? Which clients benefit the most from therapy? Um, and this is when I work with students, these are the three common examples that we hear over and over and over again. And for some reason, we want to know, how often is counseling working? What is the best type? Should I be using Gestalt? Should I be using Adlerian? Should I be using CBT? And which clients benefit? And there's an assumption. Their assumption is what Keisler labeled as uniformity myth, and basically what this is that myth that there is a better there's a better therapy or there's a better type of counseling, and so because of this leads researchers to sometimes go in and try to study these constructs, and I think that ultimately their data will not bear any type of statistical significance. And if it does, then we may have a problem on our hand. There's many different reasons why. So I think that's why you don't see many counseling studies. You don't see many manuscripts talking about what is the best type of counseling. And that's why we have so many different theories. But this uniformity myth states that we have this oversimplification to counseling and that we assume that psychotherapeutic treatments are a standard or uniform set of techniques applied in a consistent or uniform manner by a standard uniform therapist, and then we have this homogeneous uniform group of clients. And that's just not true. So even if you think about, let's say that we have two counselors and they're both trained, let's say, two counselors, they're both in my internship class, they're both narrative therapists, they use narrative therapy primarily as their way of conceptualizing and working with their clients. And so even though they have an understanding, a very similar understanding of what their clients are going through, they may be using different techniques when working with their clients. Don't forget, we have to meet our clients where they're at. So even though I'm a narrative therapist, I might use cognitive behavioral interventions or Gestalt interventions when I'm working with my clients in session. And so those two counselors are going to, even if they have similar clients, are probably going to be using different techniques based on what their clients need. So now if we're just comparing apples to apples, now we're actually comparing oranges to apples because we have two different people that are being treated by two similar, we'll call them similar counselors. And that whatever the treatment is applied in a consistent or uniform manner. Well, if you've been in practice long enough, you'll know that some clients, when they come in, they just want to get right down to work, and it's all about what interventions are we using, and how we're working on change. And then you'll have some clients that come in and they need to just kind of decompress for a little bit. And they need to talk about their week or talk about what's been going on, or they want to let you know some good things that have happened. And you may only get a half an hour of actual quote unquote therapy out of that. So now we have this different construct where we have people that are coming in with different things and working on different issues. So now we have even more variability that we're adding into it. That treatments are given by a standard uniform therapist or counselor. And I'll tell you, the students at Kutztown are extremely different from the students at ESU or Immaculata or PCOM or Duquesne or wherever they are. Even though they're being taught in a similar way, they're being taught by very different people. Even people in our program, if you've had me for multiple classes, you are going to have a different outlook on clients and how to work with them that if you had Dr. Doinez or Dr. Moss. And it's just because of the places that we come from and our understanding of working with human beings. So there really is no standard counselor or standard therapist. So now there's even more variables. So we have three different levels of extraneous variables that are built into this that are making this an extremely unique situation. And then the homogeneity of clients, meaning that all of our clients are exactly the same. And the more you work with clients, the more you'll realize that is just not the case. So we have this really unique factor of clients coming to us and all of the different factors or the constructs that they come with as individuals. And then you add on top of that the the lack of uniformity of training with it for counselors, and the lack of uniformity of working within different techniques and theories. And you put all that together, and from a correlative perspective, there's no correlation to anything that's going on. I mean, even you working with individual clients from client to client to client is going to change. But the moment that we start looking at the way that different counselors and therapists and social workers and psychologists and everybody who's part of that, it's almost unmeasurable. So the reason why we don't do many outcome studies, and even when we do outcome studies in counseling, it's just that there's so many different variables, and that's, I think, when we look at that, even, I mean, think about it from the medical standpoint. Medical model boils everything down to symptoms and symptom reduction, and that's how we measure success. And so we do these studies and we measure a very, very specific symptom with a very specific group of people in very controlled studies, and we get it wrong. We get it wrong a lot. And so imagine if we can't control for any of those variables, and then we're going to make some kind of judgment statement based on the data that we get. EMDR is one of those theories. I don't want to call it the set of interventions. That they produce research on a regular basis saying this works. And I just, I don't know how that's possible. We see some of that, like DBT has a lot of that as well, you'll see. But there are longitudinal studies, and there's large group studies that show effectiveness over a period of time for using specific theories, but in a very broad sense. And we don't have anything that shows that one is better than the other, because once we start comparing, then we get into way too many variables that just will not yield any kind of statistical data that is of any use. So I hope that kind of clears up why in therapy in its giant sense, we don't actually really do a whole lot of research in that area, because it's just not good data. So we have this saying, good data in, good data out, meaning that you collect good data and you're going to get some really good data out in your analysis, and bad data in, bad data out. So if we're collecting bad data and they are not measuring, if there's no validity or reliability, and there's no homogeneity within, then we're just going to get a mess on the outside, on the output of the data, and we're not going to be able to really make sense of anything. And then when we start making sense of bad data, that's where we start to lose credibility as researchers. So Geisler believed that the myth greatly hampered the progress in unraveling and understanding psychotherapy. The uniformity myth has hampered and continues to hamper research within counseling, because I think that people still get myopically stuck on these things. And so what we tend to see, and this is what you'll see often, is that people then start going more towards qualitative research, because qualitative is a way that we can really study what is happening with the individual in the sense of the therapy or the counseling that they're receiving. But if we know anything about qualitative, we know that qualitative is non-generalizable, and that the government's not even really considering it to be true research. So the research myth, the research design myth, leads students and even more experienced researchers to assume that there is one right or best type of research design, regardless of the types of research questions that they are examining. So the more varied the research design that you become experienced or you become accustomed to through experience, the better your research will be, because your design will match what you're trying to study, rather than trying to take your study and fit it into the research design. So research designs and methods are constantly evolving. Historically, 7 broad categorizations of research designs have been outlined. In 1963, Campbell and Stanley discussed designs according to the categories of pre-experimental designs, experimental designs, and quasi-experimental designs. And so for us, we typically land on that quasi-experimental, where we're not going to be truly manipulating data, but we'll look at differences between different groups to see if there are things happening. In 1980, Kasdan classified research design as experimental, quasi-experimental, and correlational designs, and that's kind of where we stand for the most part now. And we tend to do a lot of correlational designs, I feel, in our field. Others commonly discuss research designs according to whether the researchers utilize qualitative, quantitative, or mixed method designs. And I think that once my understanding is qualitative, quantitative, mixed method is the broad overarching design, and then within that, like if you are using quantitative, you're going to then look at whether this is going to be experimental quasi or correlational. If you're looking at qualitative, it's going to be something like phenomenological or grounded theory or ethnographic or autoethnographic. And then mixed method designs are going to take two of those and combine the quantitative and the qualitative piece, which is kind of what we're doing right now, using kind of a grounded theory where we have a theory about what's going on within, or at least the hypothesis within our research questions of what's going to happen. And then we're going to translate the qualitative data, we're going to code that into quantitative data, and we're going to take a look at that quantitative data statistically. Qualitative research relies upon naturalistic and interpretive approach in order to understand the research question of interest. What we have to really be aware is that this research is exploratory in nature and relies upon the relationship between the researcher and the subject of exploration to illuminate meaning. So when we talk about taking the subjectivity out of our research, qualitative is inherently biased because of our research biases. And so when we're engaged in qualitative research, we have to be extremely aware of our personal, professional biases that may lead us to give data through the lens of whatever our biases are. So for example, and counselors are usually really good at qualitative because when we go into the counseling session, we have to take our biases out of the session and work from a valueless-based system, meaning that we don't bring our own values into our counseling. So it should be able to be transferable to the qualitative piece where we're not going to bring our values in, but I see that is not the case. Again, I use the study that comes out every few weeks in the doctoral realm, which is the lived experiences of mothers in counseling programs. And it's amazing how every one of those studies finds something very interesting and unique. And it's usually predicated on the fact that the person who is conducting the study is a mother that's in a doctoral program. And so they have their own beliefs about what's going on, and they use the lived experiences of others as confirmational, and then they bring that out to the public and say, see, here's what we're talking about. Rarely do we find something that is contradictory in qualitative, and I think that's because of the lens of the person, the researcher, who's being biased without knowing that they're being biased. So when working in a qualitative standpoint, it's good to work in teams so that you can kind of parse out the qualitative piece. And what I would really say is the best way to do it is kind of work with somebody who is biased towards and biased against, so that they can be kind of balanced out. Dr. Duenas and I do quite a bit of mindfulness research in neuropsych research because she's a big believer in those things, and I am a non-believer in those, and that's okay. And she has that lens of counseling, and she practices that way, and she does great work through that. And I don't believe in that, and I think I do great work in that, and so that's okay. So we can come from the two different sides, but when we come together with our research, there will be times where I'll be like, well, I'm like, and then she'll be like, well, Ryan, and I'm like, oh, yeah. So we kind of are able to balance it out very well between us, and I think that we can write I don't want to say non-biased, but we can come to that middle point and recognize our biases in this. And I totally lost my spot on the slide here. I apologize. So unlike quantitative designs, qualitative approaches aim to understand through interviews, through observations, and artifacts. And when we say artifacts are kind of like notes, or you can, kind of like what we're doing in class. We're looking at Psychology Today profiles, so that those would be artifacts. and they typically produce rich descriptions of the data, and then we can make interpretations of those meanings. So qualitative methodology stress the process in which individuals create and give meaning to their social experience and their lived realities. And another thing that's really important about qualitative is, and it's said, I think it was on the last slide, but the relationship between the researcher and the participant. So there has to be some kind of rapport building that happens within that, so that the person who's being interviewed feels comfortable speaking to the researcher about the phenomenon. If there's little rapport or there's poor rapport being built, then you may not get that deep and rich data that you're looking for. On the other hand, quantitative methodologies paint a broad picture of relationships among constructs assessed through generating and averaging nomothetic data over relatively large numbers of participants. And basically what that means is that we're taking a group of data and we're generalizing it, we're surmising what's happening within that data, and then we're taking that and saying this is a phenomena or this is a construct that's happening with another large group of people. And sometimes we call it a sample and a population. So we're looking at this sample and we're making inferences on the data from that and then generalizing that to the population. Quantitative research is most closely aligned with post-positivist paradigm and seeks to test research hypotheses using scientific methodology. And this design typically relies upon numbers data rather than language data that is used in qualitative designs. And the numbers data are typically analyzed through a variety of statistical tests, and then the inferences are drawn from the samples of the population. And this is what's going to happen in our class. We're going to take a look at numbers data, and we're going to make inferences based on those numbers data. So we're going to look at correlations. We're going to maybe do some t-tests. I'm not going to give it away here in this video. We'll play around with it a little bit and see what we're coming up with, and then we'll talk about what does that mean and how are we interpreting that. And then finally, mixed methods utilizes elements from both the qualitative and quantitative designs. Using qualitative and quantitative methods together in a single study provides multiple perspectives on data that are collected and subsequently analyzed. And so this is something back from the 90s we knew we should be doing more of. And a bunch of authors have maintained that mixed method designs offer advantages to increasing knowledge because they are allowing the researchers to assess the convergence of results across the quantitative and qualitative methods, and it allows for a complementary and more in-depth understanding of the phenomenon of interest. And so breaking that down a little bit, a lot of times mixed methods, the way that this is done is that we're going to use some kind of quantitative measurement or analysis or assessment with a group of individuals, find something, and then go in and use the randomization to do interviews with people to find out exactly why these things were happening. So, for example, I might do I might do an assessment of students in internship and their perception of efficacy in becoming professional counselors. Okay, so basically what I'm looking at is, do they believe that they're going to be good counselors or not? And so I might have an assessment, a 20-item assessment, asking a bunch of questions. I give that to everybody, and then we get some data out of that. We find out that some students are really feeling like they are prepared, they're going to provide effective counseling, and then other groups have not. So then what we might do is, and this is something that I've done in the past, is we'll do group interviews where I will invite several groups of students to meet with me, usually no more than 10. And we'll meet literally at a round table, and I will record the conversations, and I'll ask, so why do some of you feel like you're going to be really good counselors? And then I'll ask, like, how many people don't feel that way and why? And then trying to find out and allow the students to have that conversation with each other about, why they feel they're very well prepared. And then some students will be like, well, I didn't have that experience. And then we can start taking those language data, putting it into another statistical program, Atlas TI, and then coding what we're hearing. And so we can say, okay, well, we have these data that show that X amount of students are feeling like they're very well prepared and they're going to provide effective counseling. And here are some of the reasons why they said that. And here's some other data that are showing that students aren't feeling very well prepared. And here are some of the statements that they're saying. So what we can then surmise is that the students who are not feeling prepared are not feeling prepared because they didn't get these experiences and so on and so forth. So it's more of that, like, hey, here's the data, the numerical data that shows there's a difference between these two groups. Like, so scientifically there's something different. But here's the qualitative data that kind of explains why there's the difference between these groups. And then we can actually start making changes in curriculum or experiences for students so that they don't have to feel that way. And so that's the goal of research right there, is to find out something so it informs future practice. So maybe that's something that we do here. We do a study like that soon. All right, so the traditional views of science, particularly as borrowed from the physical science, assume superiority for quantitative designs, and particularly for experimental laboratory designs. So according to this view, there's an implicit hierarchy of research design. So experimental designs, quantitative experimental designs are at the top. Quasi-experimental and correlational designs are somewhere in the middle of quantitative. And then descriptive and qualitative designs are at the bottom of the hierarchy. So if we were to parse that out, so quantitative experimental designs are the top, because, and the reason why they're at the top is because it's able to control for many, many, many variables. So it's going to produce data that are very much empirically sound. Quasi-experimental, correlational, quantitative designs are still going to give us a good deal of information, but there's going to be some static built into that just because of variables that we can't account for, latent variables, or variables that are confounding and we're not able to control. But it's still very, very much acceptable research. Descriptive research, quantitative descriptive research would be the next one on closer to the bottom of the rungs, where basically we're surveying people to find out what their preference of ice cream flavors are, or what type of cars they drive, and then we're putting that out there and be like, oh, well, here's the research. And is it research? Yeah, it's research. Does it really inform a lot? Nah, not really. It might be interesting to see something, but it's really probably not going to inform us too much. And then the bottom rung is qualitative designs. And that's not to say that qualitative doesn't have any value. Qualitative absolutely has value, but when it comes to the rigor of scientific methodology or research design, qualitative is very much at the bottom. And if you're interested in going into academia, qualitative may not be viewed as good research. So if you're up for tenure or promotion and you have all qualitative designs, because again, qualitative is pretty easy and it doesn't really give us much information except for information about that very specific group of people that are being studied. You might have trouble getting tenure. So staying within the experimental or quasi-experimental designs are where you want to be, but correlational is just as good as quasi. So yeah. So experimental control and generalizability, and this is kind of what I've been talking about already. So experimental controls allow researchers to make inferences about causal relationships between the variables, which is referred to as internal validity of the study. So if we can control, then we can say the causal relationship is because of these two variables, and we can say there are no other variables outside of that. Research studies that are high in experimental control typically use random selection of participants from the targeted population, random assignments of participants to groups, and the manipulation of the independent variable or of independent variables. So there is this selection of a group of people specific for a reason, and then putting them within different groups very much randomly, and then manipulating something. And the intended goal is to allow the researchers to sufficiently control or as many variables as possible to make inferences about causality. Remember, just because we can never say that X causes Y, but we could say that we're making an inference about the relationship. So we can never prove the causality. We can only make inferences about the causality. And then generalizability is the second key issue, meaning that we want to be able to extend the data or the findings to the greater population or having external validity. So scientists may be most interested in research findings that have the greatest application to real world settings. Excuse me. So research that is designed to emphasize generalizability or external validity is grounded in real world settings and therefore is sometimes the most valuable data to us. In counseling, full experimental control is often difficult and it's sometimes impossible and is often even unethical to do that. So that would be like if I had two groups, my drug and alcohol clients, and one group I decided that I wanted to give them motivational interviewing, and the other one I wanted to give them nothing. That's pretty unethical. They both need to have some sort of treatment. Not unethical on the MI side, but unethical on the no treatment side. So experimental control presents many obstacles for applied researchers who are interested in research that it involves the lives of real people who are struggling and need psychological assistance. And so for this, using that laboratory type full experimental design for us isn't something that we typically engage in. And because of that, it's understandable that within our field of literature in our research that we're not going to do that. Even though, again, on that hierarchy of research ladder where we think about laboratory experimental designs as being the top, it's just not something that we can do. So here's some classifications of research design. So descriptive laboratory studies, and these are characterized by investigations that do not exercise experimental controls such as randomization or manipulation of the independent variable, but are conducted in a laboratory setting. So a descriptive laboratory study has low external validity because it uses a setting that in some ways can only simulate real life settings. And the descriptive laboratory study is also low in internal validity, excuse me, because it lacks experimental control in the sense of manipulation of an independent variable and randomization of participants to conditions. We also have descriptive field studies. And these are investigations that do not exercise experimental control, such as randomization or manipulation of variables, and are conducted in real-life settings. So different from the laboratory studies, which would be conducted literally in a laboratory setting. And when you think about a lab setting, don't think about like a bunch of men and women and wearing white coats and messing around with lab rats and things like that. A laboratory can be like what we have up here in Old Main, where we have rooms that are set up that we can do observations of counseling. And so that would be a laboratory setting, where a field study would be like in my office, my private counseling office or something like that. Excuse me. A descriptive field study is often high in external validity because a sample of participants can be taken directly from a population of interest. So for example, if we were at my counseling practice, we could sample participants from kind of all over. So if we were interested in people who were diagnosed with a mood disorder over the age of 30 and also have a co-occurring disorder, we have a population of those, and we can select people to be part of our study if we wanted to. The descriptive field studies are low in internal validity because the variables that are being studied occur naturally rather than being manipulated again. So it lacks that true experimental feeling. Experimental laboratory studies are characterized by manipulating an independent variable, and they're conducted in laboratory settings. So it's low in external validity because it relies upon researchers setting up a situation to resemble something that occurs naturally rather than observing participants in actual real-life settings. The research is often high in internal validity because the experimenter can randomly assign participants to treatments and manipulate one or more independent variables. And because these studies have high internal validity, the researcher can and does make inferences about causality based upon the results from the study. So remember, the only time we're making any type of inferences about causality is when we're doing experimental laboratory studies. When we're not, we're making inferences about the relationship, not just not causality. And we have experimental field studies, or investigations that manipulate independent variables that are conducted in real-life settings. So experimental field study attempts to examine causality through random assignment of treatment and controlling of independent variables. So these experiments control moves the study away from the examination of naturally occurring real-life settings, yielding a moderate external validity at best, really. And the researcher can never exercise the same control in the field as the laboratory, yielding a moderate internal validity at best. So choosing a research design, well, there's no a priori best design for research within the counseling profession as a whole. So really what you're going to have to do is decide which research design is going to be most feasible for you. And we have 5 different factors that we look at when we're choosing our research design. Factor 1 is existing knowledge pertaining to the specific research question. So research on a particular question is conducted within the existing body of empirical and theoretical knowledge. So therefore, it's imperative for the researcher to ascertain what the existing literature suggests about the particular topic area and to identify the questions that remain unanswered. And I think that the research that we're doing in class, I've been working on this research in my own professional and personal research for a bit of time. So I already kind of know where the research that we're doing is going to be situated within the literature. So that helps us to formulate a particular research question, and that will add to the knowledge in the existing literature. So to my knowledge, there hasn't been any type of broad study to see what type of language is being used in the counseling field spread over an entire country, which is really what we're looking at. Second one is inferences are made to develop existing knowledge based on the research design. So the researchers must consider the inferences drawn to develop the existing knowledge base when choosing a research design. And because the type of design used affects the type of inferences that can be made in developing an extended knowledge base, the researcher should carefully consider their intentions when they're designing their study as well. So the over-reliance upon a specific design in a given topic area could produce an unbalanced and weak knowledge base. So we need to make sure that we're using different types of methods. And so if you're reading the research and you're seeing that most people are using the XY method of researching this, see if there's a different way that we could, or try to conceptualize a different way and try it out. Because we may get some different findings, or we may find that research methodology that you're using just doesn't work. And that's okay as well, because it's informing our future research. So researchers are encouraged to choose a design that will allow the research to contribute to the knowledge generation and the extension. We don't want to keep doing the same research over and over and over and over again. If it's not adding knowledge, if it's not helping expand, then it's bullshit research. And I say that specifically because last year at Pennsylvania Counseling Association's conference, awards were given. There was a research award given to Matthew Joseph, who is an associate professor at Duquesne University, was my mentor, and he's a good friend of mine. And his whole speech was really awesome. That he gave after he accepted the award was about the research that we conduct, and that we need to stop conducting bullshit research, meaning that we're just conducting research for the sake of research. We should be conducting research that's meaningful, that we find interesting, and that's going to start to change the landscape rather than just doing the same thing over and over again. So factor 2, don't conduct bullshit research. To conduct research that's going to be new and innovative. And I think that's scary for a lot of people, especially when using innovative research methods. And there's a lot of innovative research methods out there that we can talk about, more than just assessing through assessing, getting statistical data, and then doing interviews. There's so much more out there that we can be doing. Factor 3 is resources and costs associated with research design. So practical considerations are important when you are selecting a particular design. So different designs require different resources and have distinctive associated costs. The research design that we're using in class right now is, I feel, appropriate because there are no costs associated with it, and we have the resources here. So if you think about the resources needed, you have to really kind of look at everything at a macro level. So in order for us to do the research in class, the resources we need are, we need to have internet access, which we do. We're fortunate we're at a university. We need to have computers, which we do, whether provided by me or the department, or you have your own computers. We have to have access to Psychology Today, which we do. And then we have to have the knowledge to conduct the research, and which we have as well. So the resources to conduct this right now. Oh, and we have the statistical software available to us to do this as well. So that might be a thing too. Even if you want to conduct research, you may not have SPSS, you may not have Minitab, and so that may go to the resources that you have or don't have when you're trying to figure out what research design is best. So you really have to think strategically about that. And the costs, and every study has some sort of cost, whether it's finances, whether it's your time, whether you're in a physical lab, a clinical space, technology, expertise, familiarity with software. So there's always a cost to doing research, and you have to make sure that those research and those costs are within balance. Because if you are doing a research study and you get all this great quantitative data and you don't have SPSS, then you may not be able to really figure out what's going on unless you're really good with Excel and you know how to do all the formulations and calculations in Excel, or you are able to use R, which in that you have to write your own code for your statistical analysis, but it is free. So if you can do that, that's awesome. Factor 4 are threats to the validity of the specific design. So choosing a research design also requires the researcher to have knowledge of limitations or threats that are inherent within each design and how they impact those limitations on the conclusion. So you have to be able to say, like, yeah, no, this is the best design, but here's some areas or reasons why it may not be the best design, and have the ability to talk about that. Don't forget, we're not going to hide those things. We're going to tell them, here are the limitations in our study. Here are some of the things that may have caused our data to come out this way. If we can explain those variables, those uncontrollable variables, those latent variables, then our research will look or feel more valid than research if we're trying to hide those things. And then the last factor is the matching or the fit among factors 1 through 4. So trying to weigh, looking at all 4 of those factors and kind of taking all of them into perspective and saying, okay, what's the best research design that I can use based upon these criteria? And then finally, just getting to methodological diversity. So there is a growing consensus that the field of counseling is strengthened when there is a wide array of designs being utilized. And again, if you're looking at CESNet, which I'm going to hopefully introduce you guys to very soon, it's a listserv for counselor educators and supervisors. And if you're going to be in a counseling doctoral program, you'll want to be on that listserv. And it's always qualitative designs that are being used. And so we're really stifling the type of research that we can conduct. Compared to psychology or psychiatry, we are really, really far behind in the type of research that we're conducting. So the use of multiple methods is essential for important advances in counseling literature. And this may allow the discipline to grow in its ability to address research questions and topics that have relevance in the actual work that we do with clients, and to social issues as well, because those are the 2 areas as counselors that we are going to really look at. And remember that programmatic research on a particular topic is useful to extend knowledge base. So to put it another way, a series of investigations conducted by the same or different researchers that successively extends on one's knowledge base on a particular topic is highly desirable in our profession. And so that means, because, so I've had a conversation with a few of you in class about some research topics that you're interested in, and we always want to do the research that's going to give us the final answer. Like, we want to know, if this, then that, and what. And what that sometimes means is that we have to start at square one, and we might have to do a very basic research design and conduct a research study about that design that informs us about a very small detail of X. And then we're going to do another experiment on X or another research study on X to see how that correlates to Y. And then we might do another one after that. And so it's this succession of research, programmatic research, that gets us from point A to point Z. And oftentimes, as neophyte researchers, we want to get from A to Z instantaneously. But if we think about it from solution-focused standpoint, right, we have to go from A to B, from B to C, from C to D, so on and so forth. We take little steps, and then those little steps build on the past knowledge and informs us of Z, and hopefully at some point we do get to Z. Sometimes research starts at A, ends at K, L or M, and stops. And then new researchers, and we can go back at M and take it to N, to O, to P, so that we can get to Z at some point. So that's another way that we can start looking at research. And that, I think, when we talk about research lines or research agendas, when you go for interviews at doctoral programs, or if you want to end up teaching, they're going to ask you, what is your research agenda? Or what is your line of research? And so, you're going to hopefully have some research examples where you have been building on a theory, where you've been building on an understanding or something that shows that you're involved in some kind of programmatic research. Not that you did one research study on this, one research study on that, and that it's all kind of all over the place. They want you to be more focused on what your research is so that you can make those advances to the body of work that we have as counselors. So I hope that helps you better understand, that choosing a research design is very specific and intentional, and it's not just something that happens on its own. And that's the more advanced your research design is, and the more unique your research design is, the more unique your outcomes will be. And that's something that we in the counseling field need right now. So I hope that this helps kind of helps make you start thinking about different types of research designs, and we can talk about more of those designs in class. So thank you again, and I'll see you at the next video.